In today's video, I will be fixing the top of this young manufacturing credenza, which unfortunately had some unexpected issues. For background, I had restored this piece a couple months ago. It had previously been painted entirely green inside and out. It was one of the most complex restoration processes I've ever done, and due to the level of damage on the top, I had to re-veneer it. Upon completion, the piece promptly sold, and I thought that would be the last time I'd ever see it. Then one day I got a message from the buyer with the attached pictures. My heart sank. The newly veneered top was showing signs of failure, and I could not believe it. And I was also extremely confused, as I've done this process many times. I had to make this right for the buyer, so the piece came back into my possession for fixing. Looking at the piece from afar, it looked pretty good, but up close, well, that was a different story. I've seen a lot of veneer issues in my day, but I've never seen splitting and cracking like this. After looking over the piece, I believe I was able to determine the root cause. I had used a veneer sheet that I never had before, and I thought it was interesting that the backing was very fuzzy and thin, and I believe this may have been the cause of my adhesion and failure issues. I may never know for certain, but that's my story and I'm sticking to it. This piece is pretty low, so I put it up on some blocks to make the working surface higher. I then removed the drawers, as these will come in handy later in the process. To protect the rest of the piece while I'm working on the top, I used plastic wrap and tape. It was then time to start to work on removing the failing veneer. To do this, I got out my heat gun in addition to a metal putty knife. By applying heat, I was able to break the bond of the adhesive between the veneer and the substrate just enough to use my knife to push it up. I've never actually had to remove veneer that I've installed, but I was pleasantly surprised that this process worked quite well. I really tried to take my time during this step, as I didn't want to cause any additional damage to the substrate below that I would have to fix later on. Maybe it's just me, but I also found it oddly satisfying to use the heat gun to melt the clear coat on the top of the dresser. After removing the veneer, I moved on to removing the edge banding. It wasn't in bad shape. Rather, I removed it so that I can install new edge banding later in the process, which I'm going to use to hide the paper backing of the new top. By using this order of operations, it gives a more professional and cohesive look. With the veneer removed, I was looking at a mess I thought I'd never see again. My next problem was I needed to remove the remaining adhesive. For this, I broke out my favorite bottle of Goo Gone. This stuff is great. You just spray it on and it dissolves the adhesive. I like to wipe the surface after spraying to ensure an even application. After a brief wait, I use a white Scotch-Brite pad to buff off the adhesive. If you've waited long enough, the adhesive should come right off. And to wrap this part up, you just use a rag and clean off the remaining residue. Now I had a really ugly top, but at least an ugly top without adhesive on it. The next step was to fill any voids in the top to ensure that the surface was nice and smooth. For this, I used 2-part epoxy, specifically made by Quickwood. This stuff is great because it chemically dries nice and hard and it doesn't shrink, unlike traditional wood filler. Once mixed up, it's as simple as pressing the epoxy putty into the void. After everything is dried, the next step is to sand it down. I started sanding with 150 grit and slowly worked my way up to 220. The remaining paint and primer was well adhered, so the only purpose of the sanding was to make sure that the surface was nice and level. The next step was to seal the top. For this, I decided to use de-wax shellac. Spraying de-wax shellac is ideal, but I was about to wrap up for the day and didn't feel like loading and cleaning my spray gun, so I decided to wipe it on. Wiping the product on does work, but you have to move extremely fast as it dries lightning quick. As you can see in the video, the near side of the top had already dried before I finished applying it on the other side. The final step before applying some veneer is to sand the top down once more. I hand sanded it with 400 grit, as I'm just trying to knock off any dust nibs or debris that's on the top to make sure it's super smooth. That concludes the prep work, and now it's time to install the new sheet of veneer. To repair this top, I decided to go with PSA veneer, as I didn't want to mess with any fancy adhesives and I wanted a straightforward process. If you're new to veneer, PSA stands for pressure sensitive adhesive, and it's really as simple as peeling off the backing and pressing it on. It doesn't get any easier. Before applying though, I always cut it to rough size, and then I'll do the final trimming once the sheet is installed on the top. To start the application, I peel about 6 inches of the backer off and apply that section to the top. This is the starter row and what I use to align the veneer as I continue down the piece. From there, I just follow the same process. I'll peel a little bit of the backer off, apply the veneer, and continue on until I reach the other side. With the veneer set, it now needs to be firmly pressed down. For this, I like to use my fanciest piece of scrap plywood with a rounded over edge. Using this fancy tool allows me to put a ton of pressure on the top, ensuring a nice strong bond between the veneer and the substrate below. After installation, the next step is to trim the veneer down. There's a couple different ways to do this, but to keep it simple, in this video, I'm only using a razor and slowly working it along the edges of the piece. After trimming, I sand the sides down with a sanding block to refine the edge while also keeping it square. Now that the top is installed, the next step is to apply the edge banding. I'm using edge banding with heat activated glue already installed, so I just have to iron it on. It's a straightforward process of cutting your pieces to rough size, and then using an iron to melt the glue, which creates the bond between the edge banding and the top. Edge banding is sold oversized so that once installed, you can come back and trim it flush. Edge banding is sold oversized so that once installed, you can come back and trim it flush. It's a slow and steady process, but it's really satisfying at the same time. After trimming, I like to sand the side to ensure it's absolutely perfect. The last step before starting the finishing process was another couple rounds of sanding. I started sanding at 150 grit and then slowly worked my way up to 220. The top was now repaired, but now I had a color problem. Walnut gets lighter with age and UV exposure, so the newly veneered top was very different in color than the rest of the piece. I couldn't wait years for Mother Nature to do her thing, so I took matters into my own hand. To begin the color shift, I decided to apply some stain. I chose to use Czar Premium Teak oil-based stain as it's highly pigmented and matches vintage walnut quite well. The piece was starting to really turn a corner, and then I noticed a big problem. During the edge banding application, my iron must have gotten too close to the side and melted the finish. That's totally my fault, and well, since we're doing the top, might as well just do the side while we're at it. So I backtracked a bit, took off the wrapping, and then popped off the left door. From there, I just repeated the steps that I did to the top, sanding with 150 grit up to 220, and then applying the same stain. The color match at this point was good, but I could do better. The next step in the process, and arguably where the magic really happens, was applying toner. I like to make toner myself using de-wax shellac, denatured alcohol, and trans-tit dyes. These products, as well as detailed instructions, will be linked in the description below. I had a batch of leftover toner already made, so I started with that. The existing color of the toner was a good base, but I knew I'd have to make it a bit stronger to achieve the look I wanted. So I added some medium brown to the mix. As you can see, I don't really do careful measuring. I just use the Italian grandma approach, adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that until the stir stick looks good. It was at this time the next mistake happened. My mic flew off and fell into the toner. Rest in peace, Mike. You were always a great listener. It was finally time for the fun part, spraying the piece and putting my artistic touch on it. The key with toner is to apply multiple thin, light coats and slowly sneak up on the color that you want. You'll see with each subsequent toner coat, the color slowly builds. Here's a reminder of what the color looked like before we started finishing. And here's what the color looks like now. I'd say that's pretty darn good. I'm only concerned with the color at this point, not the sheen. The top coat will correct that. Shellac is a great product, but it's not very durable. So to add durability to this piece, I sprayed a couple coats of water-based lacquer. Between coats of lacquer, I very gently hand sand with 400 grit sandpaper to knock down any imperfections. And with that, the finishing process was finally complete. It was finally time to put the piece back together, so I started with removing my very ugly yet functional wrap job, and then added all the pieces back where they belong. And here's the finished product. This one came a long way. It looks like nothing ever happened, but we all know everything happened. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you are interested in seeing more content like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Till next time.